for assessment of student learning outcomes. The IOWAAN serves to establish a collaborative professional environment, promote quality, and enhance the level of recognition of academic advising, and fosters the professional development of our members. Before we begin the webinar today, let me just take care of a couple of procedural items for the webinar. First of all, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button, which you will find on the bottom banner of the screen, to submit your question in text format. Rich will take questions at the end of the session as time allows. Finally, you will be asked to complete a short assessment at the end of the webinar, and the webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the IOWAAN website within the next 2 weeks. For our webinar today, Dr. Rich Robbins, Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences at Bucknell University, will be our guide. Rich was our keynote speaker at this year's IOWAAN Institute on the Assessment of Academic Advising and for our 9th annual Drive-In Conference. Just a couple brief notes about Rich. He received his PhD in social psychology from the University of Nevada, Reno, and served as a behavioral sciences faculty member before moving into higher educational administration. He served as a faculty member at the 2005 through 2017 Assessment Institutes and served and from 2006 to 17 has served as the on the NACADA Summer Institutes, and is also one of 2 NACADA representatives on the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education. We are excited to have Rich presenting this webinar for us. So thank you, Rich, for taking the time today to facilitate our learning and understanding on this topic. Rich, you've got the con.
All right, thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to be in Iowa remotely, at least, if not in person. Some of this may be familiar to you if you attended either the seminar or the workshop or the conference in the spring. But even if you didn't, there'll be enough basic review, so hopefully you'll be able to catch on pretty quickly. And as David said, you can post questions and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. So here we go. The first thing we talked about at the workshop in the spring was the assessment cycle. What I'm going to talk about today specifically is how to develop measures for the student learning outcomes once you've defined what it is you want students to get from academic advising. Once the desired student learning outcomes have been identified, and you've also mapped where those learning opportunities are, the next step is to determine how you're going to measure things, when you're going to measure them, what instruments you're going to use, what needs to be developed, who needs to be included, and so forth. So this is the assessment matrix or the assessment table. And you can see there are basically 3 columns here. This is not a standard one, but this is the one that NACADA tends to use. You can see that the highlighted red, outcome measures, data instruments, minimum performance criteria for success, or threshold. That's what we're going to focus on today. So again, the assessment cycle includes a consideration of your institutional mission statement, your local mission statement for advising, what your programmatic goals are, and then identifying the specific student learning outcomes you want students to achieve as a result of advising. Once you achieve an outcome, or once you identify an outcome, then you need to identify where the students have the opportunity to learn these. Is it just in an advising session? Is it from a website? Is it from a first-year course? Where can students learn this information? And then also identify by when you would like them to learn this. Would you like them to achieve this learning outcome by the end of the first semester, by the end of the first year, by the end of their junior year, and so forth? The identification of the opportunities and the identification of by when you would like them to achieve this learning is basically the mapping of the outcomes, where the opportunities are, and when do you want them to learn it by. At that point, then you can determine how you're going to measure it and what instruments you're going to use. But you need to know by when you want them to achieve it in order to know when to assess it, okay? So we're working past the first several columns here and right into outcome measures, data instruments, and minimum performance of criteria. So for any given student learning outcome, when you measure, you need to use multiple measures. That is more than one measure for any student learning outcome. Why multiple measures? Well, as we all know, this is social science, so everything is correlational. There are no true cause and effect statements. So what you need are multiple correlational measures to determine what the pattern is and what your best guess of what is occurring based on the data. No single assessment or evaluation instrument is perfect or precise. And so, as Suski said in 2009, we strive to make assessments sufficiently truthful. So we need multiple measures to come up with what we feel is sufficiently the truth based on these multiple swipes of information. So we can have reasonable confidence in our findings, and we can use the findings and the data with enough assurance to make decisions. We all hear the terms data-driven or data-informed decision-making, and this is one form of gathering data for your student learning outcomes to determine what's working, what isn't working, and what are students getting out of your academic advising. Schulman called it a union of insufficiencies, again, because no individual measure is sufficient or perfect, so you have to combine them. So multiple measures means going beyond a simple satisfaction survey or an advisor evaluation. In fact, it is kind of dangerous to base any decisions, especially resource decisions, whether it be personnel and or money, on a student satisfaction survey. Student satisfaction is student perception. What they felt about the interaction, was it positive or negative to them? So you may be the best advisor in the world, you may have the best program, you may have provided information in the best sufficient, clear manner, but it might be news that they don't want to hear. So they may not give you a high satisfaction rating, even though you're being very truthful, very efficient, and very professional. Same thing with advisor evaluation. Again, advisors may evaluate students' behaviors or students' achievement of learning on a certain outcome, but again, it's based on advisor perception. So satisfaction surveys and advisor perception surveys and evaluations can be part of the multiple measures for any given student learning outcome, but a satisfaction survey or perception survey by itself is not assessment of student learning. So if there's one thing to take away from this today, and I usually have people repeat this in person when I'm doing this in person, one evaluation is not assessment. I can hear you all saying it right now. One evaluation is not assessment. An individual measure that evaluates a single dimension of a single phenomenon is just that. It's focusing on one thing. In the case of a satisfaction or perception survey, it's evaluating perception. It's not evaluating learning. So assessment is the overall look at a whole program. Evaluation tends to be at the individual level. You're evaluating an individual advisor. Students are saying how satisfied or not they were with the situation. Students are saying they feel, they perceive, they received adequate information or not. But you're not really measuring student learning. That is, did they achieve what you wanted them to achieve? It is important to know student satisfaction levels and student perceptions, but when we're talking about assessment of academic advising, we're talking about assessment of student learning at the programmatic level. And the information or the data is obtained through multiple measures for any single outcome, and it's reported in the aggregate, not at the individual level. This is a very important quote. One of the most dangerous and persistent myths is the challenges of assessing student learning will be met if only the right instrument can be found. The NACADA Executive Office and those of us who consult on assessment and present on assessment in NACADA, we constantly get this question. What is the one tool I can take back to my campus to assess academic advising? We have people who come to the Assessment Institute stating the purpose for them attending the Institute is to learn that one assessment tool that they can take back to their campus. There is no one magic bullet. There is no one assessment tool. If there was, I would hopefully be a millionaire because I would have marketed it and you wouldn't be seeing me here today. But there isn't. So multiple measures. There is no one single measure, no one magic bullet, and what works on one campus may or may not work on another campus. So when you hear the term best practices, I like to call them informed practices, because you don't know if it's a best practice unless you use it on your campus, with your students, for your program, your programmatic goals for advising, and your student learning outcomes for advising. And then you assess it and you determine if it is a best practice for your campus. So when I hear the term best practice out there, I kind of shudder, and I always ask, how do you know it's a best practice for you? We don't. So for example, if here at Bucknell, where I am, we have 2,900 students, private liberal arts school. If I were to develop an assessment process for student learning outcomes, and I were to present it at a conference, and somebody from a school the size of the University of Michigan or Texas or University of Iowa were to take that survey or that instrument and use it on their campus, it probably wouldn't be effective, because I have a completely different type of institution, smaller population, different cohorts of students, different focus, different mission of the institution, and so forth. So there is no one magic bullet. As I said, there is no one assessment tool that can be used universally across all academic advising in higher education. So keep that in mind when we talk about multiple measures. Now, when we use multiple measures, it's good to use mixed methods. For those of you who have had a research methods class or a stats class in the past, these terms should be familiar to you. So we have qualitative, quantitative, direct, and indirect measures. Using mixed measures, a minimum of 3, which I'll talk about specifically in a minute, in your assessment of student learning outcomes, helps ensure validity of any one measure. So ideally, you would use a combination of qualitative, quantitative, direct, and indirect, minimum of 3 measures for any single student learning outcome. Just quickly, a brief review. Qualitative analysis or qualitative inquiry is very exploratory. The information is typically provided by the students or the sample in words, whether written or recorded somehow. We tend to use small samples. It's open-ended in that the questions are open-ended and the students can respond freely. We often need to prompt students to add information. The information is emerging, so you need somebody to take a look at that information, code it, look at the patterns that are emerging, and understand what overall all of the students are saying to come up with conclusions from qualitative data. So it's subjective and inductive, and some examples are focus groups using open-ended questions, individual case studies, talking one-on-one with people using open-ended questions, and observing and recording what goes on in advising interaction. So you get a lot of information, a lot of in-depth qualitative data, but then somebody has to code that information, and ideally you use 3 different coders who are trained coders, so you get what's called inter-rater reliability or inter-coder reliability. So you know what the information is telling you. Quantitative is typically what our upper administration wants to hear. They want to hear just descriptive statistics. What percentage of students did this? What number of students were retained? What percentage of students persisted to graduation in 6 years, and so on. Because descriptive is answered in numbers or percentages, and it uses closed end or what we call forced choice items, you can use very large samples. The information is more objective and it's more deductive in interpreting the information. Closed-ended questionnaires, closed-ended surveys, and true experiments where you have a control group and an experimental group. If the data is reported in numbers, that would be quantitative. So the information is in the form of numbers or statistics, and typically descriptive statistics, averages, standard deviations, and so forth. Qualitative assessments are flexible and naturalistic and are analyzed by looking for recurring patterns and themes. So that's where the intercoder reliability comes in. Somebody has to take a look and see what the themes and the patterns are. Quantitative assessments are easier to use, they're more structured, and the information can be easily summarized because it's in number. Now, ideally, when you're developing a survey of some type or a measure that is going to be quantitative, you would start with the qualitative process with open-ended questions. You would gather at least 3 coders who are trained to take a look at the information, look at what they can agree upon with intercoder reliability, and then from that information, you would develop your quantitative items for your quantitative instrument. So even developing a survey takes time. It takes training of coders. It takes people who know how to develop questions and ask questions qualitatively. It takes people who can interpret the information and develop items for quantitative assessments. So developing these types of measures is not quick or easy either. A direct measure can be either qualitative or quantitative, but the focus of a direct measure is that you are somehow directly observing the behavior. The student is somehow directly demonstrating their learning. So, for example, a pre-test, post-test of a variable. If you want to know, as a result of advising, that students know the general ed curriculum, maybe before their advising meeting, you give them a pre-test and ask them questions specifically about the general ed curriculum. Then they go through the advising process, which should include information about the general ed curriculum. Then they take a post-test. And you can see the learning that has occurred as a result of the interaction. So you get a pre-test and post-test of the same items, and you can see what value added the advising interaction actually had. There are standardized tests and inventories out there that measure student learning that can assess evaluate direct information. Any kind of tracking of student data, retention rates, persistence rates, and so forth is direct. The main thing about direct is that we're not relying on perceptions or ratings by students. We're actually looking to see what they can do or what they know as a result of academic advising. Indirect then can also be qualitative or quantitative, but those are relying on student perceptions or advisor interpretations of what occurred. So again, focus groups, surveys, interviews, reports, tracking of student perceptions, tracking of advisor perceptions. We're not observing the learned behavior directly. We're not asking students to demonstrate their knowledge directly. We are relying on their reports, indirect. So direct evidence is tangible, self-explanatory, and very compelling. It tells you what students have learned and what have not learned. Indirect consists of proxy science, students' evaluations or perceptions. Indirect evidence is less clear and less convincing than direct evidence. Our accreditation agency, for any student learning outcomes we assess in any area at Bucknell, they want a minimum of 1 direct and 1 indirect measure. We tend to use 3, at least when we're assessing advising here, because if you get information from a direct measure that contradicts the information from an indirect measure, how do you know which one is valid? And so you need that 3rd measure to triangulate. So NACADA recommends a minimum of 3 outcome measures for each student learning outcome, mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, direct, and indirect. So you can see that if you come up with 2 or 3 outcomes to assess in one assessment cycle or one academic year, and you have a minimum of 3 measures for each of those, that's 9 measures you're gathering data for. So it's a good idea when you are assessing outcomes to assess no more than 1 or 2 every cycle. Otherwise, the measurement can get too out of hand, but I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Measures should also include existing institutional data. So there's probably data being gathered by your institution. Most institutions are members of some kind of national or international standardized, whether it's NESE or BESE, which are self-report. Maybe ACT data, maybe you have homegrown surveys, but there's probably information that's already being collected that could help inform at least one of your multiple measures for a given outcome. So institutional research folks, your registrars, they are stakeholders in this process, and they should be part of your stakeholder group, your primary stakeholder group. It should be involved as you're developing your student learning outcomes and your measures. Don't reinvent the wheel. See what's going on out there. Find out what already is being gathered. Get to know your institutional data people. And remember, even if they can provide data, any single measure that relates to your student learning outcome is just one of 3 multiple measures minimum you should use. So once you identify the student learning outcome and you identify the measures, then you need to say, okay, at what level do our students need to achieve this outcome to say that we're being successful? I know we all want to say 100%, but very rarely do students achieve 100% on any student learning outcome. So would 50% be enough? Would 75% be enough? How can you determine at what level should students achieve this outcome to say that our academic advising is effective? Well, maybe there's existing institutional data that is already out there that can inform. Maybe you're using peer institutions for benchmarking. If you have peer institutions who are assessing their academic advising, you can see what they're doing. If you have common student learning outcomes, you can see what their levels are, and you may want to match that or be higher than that. Accreditation requirements, if you have not regional accreditation, but if you have a business program accredited or an engineering program accredited or a social work program accredited by an outside agency, they may have requirements. TRIO programs have requirements. So you may have requirements set for you. You may look at the literature, you may do pilot assessments, but if none of this information exists, and this is what we reiterate over and over, your very first time through assessing any student learning outcome should be a baseline data gathering process, because you don't know what's occurring out there. So you don't want to say we're only successful if 90% of our students are achieving this outcome, because you don't know what level is achieving it. So the first time through, use it as a baseline data gathering. Then the next time you assess it, you can identify targets for thresholds that you want to achieve. Here's an additional important consideration. Even if your outcome data supports the achievement of the desired student learning outcome, so let's say even if you're showing through your outcome measures that, yes, by the end of the first year, students know their general education curriculum. How do you know the student learning was a result of academic advising? Because remember, we are assessing academic advising. I've been in conversations where people say, well, it doesn't matter where they learn it as long as they learn it, and that's fine if that's what your institution or your program agrees upon. But if you want to say we are assessing academic advising specifically, then we have to say, as a result of academic advising, students are achieving these things. So how do you know? Well, you either have to observe the learning, maybe through the pre-test, post-test, or literally ask the students, where did you learn the information? How did you know to do that? How did you know to use the resources on campus? Did you learn that through advising or somewhere else? So whatever the student learning outcome is, if the students are achieving it, you may then need to follow up with focus groups or an additional question or item, asking them, from where did you learn this information, or from whom did you learn this information? Because you need to be able to connect it directly to academic advising, because we are assessing academic advising. Again, Linda Suski, in a way, good assessment is teaching to the test. We know what we want students to achieve, so we set up the opportunities through the experiences to learn that, the information advisors provide, and then the measures we use in our assessment. So we know what we want students to learn, and we teach to the test. Assessment is part of a process that identifies what we want students to learn, provides them with the opportunities to learn them, and then assesses whether they learn those things. Okay? So again, you identify your student learning outcomes, you identify when and where the opportunities for these outcomes to be learned occur. You identify the deadline by which you want students to learn the outcome, and you might have first year outcomes, you might have sophomore year outcomes, you might have semester by semester outcomes. I've seen institutions who have, by the end of the first 6 weeks of the first semester, a first year student should A, B, C, D. Whatever is important to your institution and your program, whatever your student learning outcomes are, they are developmental, so you need to identify by when you want them to occur, and then we get into the measurement part. Okay, so Hopefully everybody's with me so far. Now I'm going to talk about some sample student learning outcomes and measures. And David had asked participants to send some outcomes that you may have developed or may be working on at your institutions. We took a look at those, and I took from those that were provided, I took 3 that tend to be general enough that cover many of what everybody was talking about. So I'm going to go through each of these 3. And one's a cognitive student learning outcome, what it is we want students to know as a result of advising. One's a behavioral student learning outcome, what we want students to do as a result of advising. And one's an affective student learning outcome, what we want students to appreciate or value as a result of advising. So first one is cognitive. As a result of academic advising, students know where to find information on academic requirements. So we're not saying they use the information, we're saying they know where to go to find the information on academic requirements. And because it's a result of academic advising, we need to make sure our advisors are trained and developed and know where to send students for this information, and that that information is delivered during the advising interaction. So how can we assess, what measures can we use to determine whether students know where to find information on academic requirements? So here's a direct measure, pre-test, post-test. Again, prior to their first advising experience, you could give them a set of questions. Where can you find information on the general education requirements? Where can you find information on the major requirements? Who should you talk to about how to declare a major? Whatever the requirements are, where can you go to find the minimum GPA to graduate? Give them a pre-test. Then during the advising interaction, the advisor provides that information. Then you do the post-test, and that's a direct measure of what they learned. The pre-test and post-test items should be identical. The information during the advising session should focus on this student learning outcome, which means the advisors have to be trained and know this information. And then you can compare the post-test data to the pre-test data and have a direct measure of student knowledge. Another important thing to keep in mind is, what do you consider your academic advising program? On our campus, we have the one-on-one advising, we have group advising, we have our first semester seminar in which the faculty member of that class is the advisor for the students in that in the seminar course. We have website, an advising website. We have all those things are considered part of our advising program. So if we identify the opportunities for students to achieve these outcomes based on these different areas, and they're all part of advising, and students say, yes, I learned it during my first year seminar, or I learned it in my advising session, we can still say it was due to academic advising. So you need to think about what encompasses your academic advising. Okay, back to the measures. So pre-test, post-test could be a direct measure, one measure of at least 3. Identifying on a survey from a list of options. Maybe 50 random students that come through an advising center or through advisors' offices, you say, okay, here's a list of courses. Which ones, I'm sorry, not courses. Here is a list of places where you can gather information. Which of these places can you go or can you access to find information on academic requirements? And you have some true and some false answers in there, and see which ones they select to see if they know where to find information on academic requirements. During an advising meeting, interacting with the student and the advisor filling out a rubric, or the advisor after the meeting taking notes saying this student knew where to find information on academic requirements. And asking students, do you know where? Which would be an indirect measure, self-perception. So there are 4 different individual outcome measures for that one student learning outcome. Students know where to find information on academic requirements. You don't have to assess every student or measure every student on every outcome. We can use samples, whether it's random samples or strategic samples, but you don't have to assess every student as long as you can generalize from your sample back to the student population, because you don't want to become overwhelmed with gathering the data. All right, so 4 outcomes based on that. Pre-test, post-test, quantitative. Identifying from a survey list of options would be quantitative, but direct. Demonstrating during an advising meeting would be more qualitative. And self-perception would probably be quantitative, but indirect. So think about a student learning outcome, a cognitive student learning outcome you would like students to know as a result of your advising. Think about by when you would like them to know it. And think about the opportunities for them to learn it. Then once you have all that identified, think of a minimum of 3 different measures and how you can administer or how you can access those measures in order to make the best possible decision on whether students are achieving the outcome or not. Okay, let's move on to a behavioral outcome. As a result of advising, students utilize their degree audit. So not only do we want them to know how to access it, we want them to actually use it. And since using or utilize is the verb, it's a behavioral student learning outcome. So maybe the advisor asked them, okay, get on the computer here and show me how to use your degree audit. And then the advisor becomes the expert who rates on a rubric or in notes, in a note system that the students could or couldn't do it. So they actually demonstrate the behavior. That's a direct measure. They self-report. Did they correctly use their degree audit? Yes or no, or on a scale from 1 to 5. Self-report, that's indirect. How many students utilizing degree audit combined with correct course schedule? So we can get a lot of metrics from our websites. We can see how many clicks, how many students access the website, how many students access their degree audit. And then we can complement that or supplement that with information from a random set of schedules for the next semester. Okay, X number of students utilize the degree audit. X percentage of students have correct courses. You can infer that they were using the degree audit correctly. So they could demonstrate it directly. They could report that they're using it correctly. And we can use proxies such as the number of students accessing it and whether their schedules are correct or not to determine, are they correctly using their degree audits? So 3 measures there for the outcome students correctly use their degree audit. Again, you would need to know by when you want that to occur, which would then inform when you take these measures. So 1 cognitive student learning outcome, 1 behavioral student learning outcome. Third one, as a result of advising students, value diverse perspectives. Maybe one of your student learning outcomes for academic advising is, we want to promote, we want students to value diversity and diverse perspectives as a result of advising. That's something we value. That's one of our goals, part of our mission statement for advising. So we want our advisors to promote that in their interactions, and we want students to achieve that. So how can we measure whether students are valuing diverse perspectives as a result of advising? Well, we could ask students a self-perception question. Do you value diverse perspectives? On a scale from 1 to 5, how highly do you value diverse perspectives? You could have a pre-test, post-test. There are a lot of different diversity inventories out there. You could work with your various units on campus that focus in that area to develop a homegrown type of inventory. But you could ask questions that relate to diversity before and then after the advising interaction. And that would be, again, a direct measure to see if students gained any diversity or any valuing of diverse perspectives as a result of advising. And an advisor's rating of advisees valuing. During the discussion, during talking about diverse perspectives, did the student demonstrate that they valued diverse perspectives, or were they very closed off to that idea? And then the advisor, again, rating on a rubric or rating or putting notes in a system. And again, not for every single possible student, because that would add to an individual advisor's workload, but for a random sample or the next 20 students who come through. And then again, even if they achieve these, how do you know it's a result of advising? Well, the pre-test, post-test could kind of tell you directly, but the other 2 you would have to follow up and ask them, okay, you said you value diverse perspectives and your advisor rated you as valuing diverse perspectives. where did you learn to value diverse perspectives? And if we want it to occur as a result of advising, hopefully they mention advising or select advising from a list of possible resources as to where they learned it. Okay, so remember, in order to connect the learning that has occurred, you must either observe it directly or ask students where they learned or developed it. One thing we do here for our first year student learning outcomes, we have a completely faculty-based advising system, and our faculty advisors ask that we be as unintrusive as possible when assessing student learning outcomes, because they didn't want to have to stop an advising session and fill out a rubric or put information into a computer. So one of our measures is a survey, but we were able to develop direct measure questions on that survey and follow-up questions. Where did you learn this? So if it was achieved, where did you learn this? And then give them options, including academic advising. And we've been able to identify direct learning from that instrument and also attributions of students learning it from academic advising. And again, so this is social science, so it's not direct cause and effect, but we have good correlational data and good attributional data from the students saying that they learned it from academic advising. Again, you do not need to assess each and every student in your population for each desired student learning outcome. You want people to buy into assessment. You don't want to overwhelm people. You want to make the measurement aspect part of everyday activities. So, and there are probably certain times of the year that you know are not the best to ask questions. When I was at another institution, one of the genius higher administrators there wanted to know student perceptions of advising. And he developed a survey on his own, and he handed it out to students waiting in line in a hall at the peak times for academic advising. Now, this was 20-some years ago, so we didn't have all the technology we have now. So students were waiting in line outside of an advising center to see an advisor, and he picked that time to ask them how they felt about advising. So you have to think about the timing of it. You have to think about which students we should ask, when we should ask. Maybe during the rush at the beginning of the semester, it's not a good time to assess their perceptions of advising. Maybe you wait until they are advised for the next semester. You don't have to do every single student. You can do random sampling, purposeful sampling. For example, if you want a sample of students who are very representative of your student demographics, then you need to have those percentages in your sample. So if you're 40% male and 60% female, your sample should be 40-60. If you're 12% minority, underrepresented populations, then your sample should be 12% underrepresented populations. So you can make the generalizations to the general population. Cluster sampling, the next 20 that come in, we're gonna do. And then we're gonna wait 2 weeks, and then the next 20 that come in, we're gonna do. We're gonna do it in clusters, but throughout the semester. Some type of systematic sampling, every 5 that come through, every 10 that come through. During this 2 weeks, we're not doing any. During the next 2 weeks, we're doing every 10th student, so, or some other sampling technique. And this is where your institutional research people can come in and help you to pick out the best way to sample. All right, so to be continued for your program, ideally what you would do is select one of your own student learning outcomes, whether it's a cognitive student learning outcome, a behavioral student learning outcome, or an affective student learning outcome, and identify 3 ways to measure whether or not that specific outcome has been met, including the outcome measures, hopefully mixed measures, qualitative, quantitative, direct, and indirect, the minimum performance criteria for success, and remember the first time through, call it a baseline. You're just gathering data for the baseline. You're going to do some interventions based on that baseline, and then you're going to assess it later on again, your next cycle. And then what data instruments are you going to use? What's out there already? What's being collected? What do you need to develop? Share them, get feedback, revise, and do the same for all the student learning outcomes you want to assess this cycle. All right, I'd like to give you one more hint for assessment. If you've never done assessment before, and you know there was a student learning outcome anecdotally that is being met, identify that as a specific student learning outcome and measure that your first cycle. That will help get buy-in for the process. That will show that you're doing a good job because it will be successful, and it will get people feeling good about the assessment process. So that's a hint to take with you. That's all I have as far as this presentation goes. So I guess we have a few more minutes if we have any specific questions, or we can generalize questions from the group. I'm happy to do some questions.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate your comments. I do want to encourage anyone who has any questions to go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of the banner on Zoom to be able to submit those questions. And we've had some questions submitted already, but we do encourage you to continue to submit those questions. Rich, let me ask you this question here first. How do you determine what type of sampling is to be used with each of the multiple measures? Does it have to be the same for each, or can it be different, or does it matter?
Oh, that's a very good question. Ideally, because most of our information will be presented in descriptive statistics, percentages, and so forth, ideally you would have the same number of students in each kind of bin. So if you're doing a qualitative, you would have maybe 15 or 20 students through focus groups, and then you would survey 15 or 20 on something, and then the 15 or 20 that come through, you would have comparable numbers, so you can compare across the measures and be more statistically sound across all three measures, because you can't control for everything in social science, and maybe the next 20 students who come in are the ones who are most prepared for some reason. So if you have the same number in each kind of bin, or for each measure, that makes it more comparable. I always suggest a minimum of 30 for each measure, because 30 seems to be the magic number for statistical significance if you go that far and do significance testing. But it depends on your population too. If you have a first-year class of 20,000 students, well, that'd be a big school. If you have a first-year class of 5,000 students, you might want to do 10% of that population to be able to generalize. But I would say whatever number you use for one measure, you use the same number of students for the other measures.
Another question here that's been asked, and obviously you've already mentioned that what is a best practice for one school is not necessarily a best practice for another, but what the question was is, what are, well, we won't call them best practices, but good practices to encouraging students to complete assessment, as well as delivery of assessment to students in particular? How do we get students to encourage them, but also what is the best way nowadays to getting students to be able to actually engage in those assessments?
Yeah, so a lot of schools, including ours, have now included institutional research folks on our advising committees, campus-wide advising groups who are doing assessment. And our institutional research folks can tell us throughout the academic year when the various surveys are going to be presented. So we're a NESE school, so when is NESE going to be given? When is BESE going to be given to the first year students? We do some other nationally normed surveys, so they can map out when the best time would be to do the measures for the students. Also, you need to keep in mind by when you want students to achieve the outcome, because it's at that deadline where you should assess it to see if it's been achieved. If you want students to achieve something by the end of the first year, you should assess them at the end of their first year, not wait till the beginning of their sophomore year and have that summer gap in between. So knowing by when you want them to achieve it also helps determine the timing of it. So utilize your institutional research folks, see what the best times are to get students to participate, because students get, survey fatigue, questionnaire fatigue. So they can identify kind of the best times to reduce that. The other thing is we offer incentives. We offer, if a student participates, even though it's still self-selection of our survey tool anyway, if a student participates, they're put in a drawing for a $100 certificate at our bookstore. We have a Barnes & Noble bookstore. So that's another way. Some institutions have students complete a survey on their way out of the advising center. Some institutions, if the first year experience is part of their advising program, they capture the information at the end of that semester, if it's an outcome that needs to be achieved by the end of the first semester. You know, so it depends on the timing of it and what kind of data you can gather. If you have a captive audience, like in a class, we use first 100 level courses oftentimes at the end of the spring semester, and take 5 minutes at the end of a class that faculty agree to allow us to administer some type of measurement, because the bulk of the students in those classes are first year students. So if you can get a kind of a captive audience, you get a higher response rate. Then you can pick out 30 randomly selected item or responses. If it's part of a first year experience, you have a captive audience. If you're doing it self-selection, we add incentives. We used to do the NESI by hand, and students would have to fill out the NESI before they could get their cap. Seniors would have to fill it out before they can get their cap and gown the day before graduation. And of course, the data wasn't that valid because students were just picking C all the time just so they could get their cap and gown. So you have to think about the timing, but work with your institutional research folks, get incentives if you can, and utilize courses to get high response rates if possible.
Rich, if I can ask a follow-up question, is there a percentage of students, or what's the percentage that we should have for response rate for random sampling, or does it matter what type of sampling? Is there kind of a good response rate from a participatory standpoint? Yeah,
historically, good response rates are between 15 and 20%. Our self-selection inventory, or our self-selection survey at the end of the year, that again includes both direct and indirect measures, we get about 22%, so that's pretty good. But then we follow that up again by utilizing classes. So if you can get between 15 and 20% for a self-selected survey, that's really good. The thing you have to consider, though, are the limitations to that, because it is self-selection, and the people who self-select are usually those who are very happy or those who are very upset about something, which is another reason why you need 2 additional measures for any single outcome, because what that survey item might be telling you may or may not be valid, and you need the other 2 items or the other 2 measures to compare it to.
We have another question. Rich, do you coordinate with other offices that coordinate large assessment initiatives to ensure that you're not over surveying students? Some institutions have survey cycles to prevent survey fatigue. Is that common? And is it reasonable to think that we can coordinate surveys with other surveys? So obviously, I think the point is campus-wide coordination of assessment. Is it possible?
Yes. So yes, we coordinate with our institutional research folks. We have a campus-wide assessment committee, and then we also have our advising committee, but we have other committees too that are involved in assessment. All of our academic departments are doing assessment. Our student life folks are doing assessment. Our accreditor has told us that they're going to start looking at not just what learning occurs in the students' curricular experiences, but what occurs across the 4 years for their entire learning process, co-curricular, extracurricular, and so forth. So we have started training for assessment across the board, including athletic teams, residential learning, student affairs, student organizations, student groups. So we rely on our institutional research folks to tell us the best timing of the surveys, the best timing of focus groups, the best timing of sampling students, and so forth, based on what else is going on. So as I said earlier, the institutional research folks are very important primary stakeholders in this process. So they should be, if not on your assessment committee for advising, they should be consulting with you for all of this process. So the short answer is yes, coordinate with your institutional research folks. At a previous institution, we were fortunate enough to have a survey research institute on campus who did the entire survey for us. At another institution, there was a senior marketing class who took proposals for projects for their senior year, and the advising center I was in submitted a proposal, and it got accepted, and they did the whole, they came in and talked to us, found out what we needed, and they took off and did it for us. So yeah, coordinate with people around campus to find those best times, those peak times for survey fatigue, and then the best times for your for your surveys and your other focus groups and so forth to go out. I keep saying surveys, and again, a survey is not the best tool or the only tool. So there are other ways of gathering the data as well, but definitely consult with others who put them on your committees.
Great. Thank you, Rich, for the answer to that question. We've still got a few more minutes. I've got a couple more questions that we can see if we can try to answer. Rich, is there or should there be a time frame for multiple measures to be conducted for an outcome?
Okay, so that's tricky. So for any given outcome, you identify the opportunities for learning. Maybe it starts at orientation, it goes through their first advising session, it goes through advising for registration for the next semester, it goes through a group advising session. There are opportunities through websites and online information. All these opportunities exist for students to learn this information. But by when do you want them to achieve it? So once you identify by when, what that deadline is for them to achieve it, that informs when you do the measures. You should do the measures as close to that by when as you can. So if you want students to know the requirements for graduation after their first semester, you should assess it in December or late November before students go away for break. If you want them to know something at the end of the first year, measure it in April or May before students go away for the summer, before commencement. Because you can use random samples, you don't have to use the same 30 students for all three measures. Some of the data you can be gathering all year long if you want to determine if students can utilize their degree audit. For example, you could take some students during the registration for next semester and assess whether they're doing it. You can do it at the end of the year. So it's that deadline by which you want students to achieve it that tends to determine when the measures will be taken. But because you're using multiple measures, you're using different samples of students for each one of the measures.
Great, thanks, Rich. I've got one more question to ask, and then we'll give participants a chance to answer the final poll that you have for us. Okay. In a minute, 2 minutes or less, how do you handle multiple measures that may not corroborate results? So you talk about doing 3 of them. What happens if you're not getting clear answers from 3 or more results?
Yeah, well, then you report that. You report that this measure showed this measure showed that, this measure showed that, and then you need to go back and take a look at the process. Were the measurements appropriate? This is kind of the meta assessment of your assessment process. Were the measurements appropriate for this outcome? One of the biggest issues people have are identifying correct measures for the outcome. So if you want students to value the academic advising interaction, and your measurement is the number of students who come back from multiple visits, that's not a measure of valuing. That's a measure of how many students come back from multiple visits. You need to make sure your outcomes measure, or your outcome measurements actually measure the student learning outcome. But if you find such a discrepancy between the 3 different measures, you report it as such, you go back and you look at your methodology. Were the questions you used correct? Were the instruments you used correct? Was the student learning outcome understood? And see if there are any issues in the methodology, and then assess it again the next cycle and see what you get.
Right. Rich, I want to thank you from the Iowa Academic Advising Network for your time today and your sharing of your knowledge and wisdom and insights on assessment.
Thank you.
We will have the recording made available to on the website, as well as, I believe, Rich, it's okay with you if we also do the PowerPoint slides as well?
Sure, yep.
Great. So for those participants, thank you very much for engaging with us in this webinar. You should now see on the screen a poll. It is a 5-question poll that we are doing with Rich to see, to have your insights about the outcomes of this particular webinar. With that, please take your time to do that. And thank you for participating in the Iowa webinar today. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.